So today, as we talk about these 7 principles, one of the first things I always like to put up here is that when we do this is going to be for education purposes only, so I always start with a disclaimer there. So the information that's contained in this presentation is not to take the place of any counseling. It's not to take the place of any kind of diagnosis or treatment, but it will contain information that you can use and apply and strategies that you can begin to use in your own relationships, whether you're in the courtship phases of your relationship or whether you're already in your marriage. The information that's presented here, I believe you will find to be invaluable. So the information is going to be largely coming from an author whose name is John Gottman. He runs a marriage clinic up in Seattle, and it was actually based out of the University of Washington that's up there in Seattle, or up near Seattle, and he had what was called a marriage clinic. In the beginning of his book, he talks about how if you saw this couple that was being recorded, it just looked like a normal day in their apartment. But what looked like an apartment and a nice day where they're just sitting at the table drinking coffee or whatever their favorite morning beverage was, you would quickly notice that they would have a mic strapped to them. They would have an apparatus tied around their chest to make sure that it measures their heart rate and everything else to see how they're responding to their discussions that they're having with each other. And in his love lab, one of the things he wanted to do is he wanted to get beyond just the typical way in which people are asked about their marriage. So usually you'll get some sort of questionnaire that says, how happy and satisfied are you with your relationship? When I work with couples now, I work up in Lakewood, and I work with the Stephen A. Cole Military Family Clinic that's out there, and I see a lot of couples, and there's like one that's called a couple satisfaction index. It's a 4-question one that says, overall, how happy are you with your marriage? And when we ask those kinds of questions of people, sometimes people give the truth, and then sometimes people give the answer that is like the right answer, as though we're being graded on it. And so one of the things that he wanted to do is he wanted to find out, okay, what's really going on in their bodies when they say these things? Does their heart rate go up? Are they starting to show signs of distress? Like, what's really happening in the body? And so he did his research to that kind of detail. He took blood tests and did all those kind of things. Y'all don't have to worry about that because I won't be doing that for you all today. But what we will do is we'll talk about what he learned from the research. So we're going to be looking at just a few things here. The first part is going to be looking at some of the statistics, some of the myths around marriage, what are the costs, and I'm going to avoid the financial pieces of it. This is more so in the relational aspects, the benefits, and what are the solutions that help marriage to be successful. So one thing that in the further nights we'll talk about attachment styles. This is something that they've noticed that people have a specific way in which they relate in relationships. You can have people who have what are called secure attachments, where the person feels like they can manage their relationships autonomously, they can build trusting relationships, and this usually will happen if they've had an upbringing or an environment they came up in that allowed them to develop these kind of secure relationships. Then you have insecure, anxious attachments. People who develop this kind of attachment style tend to be a little more on the insecure side. And oftentimes in movies, the insecure or anxious attachment style is kind of like that person who is always suspicious or always concerned that the other person is doing something and constantly kind of pursues or maybe even kind of nags in the relationship because if they can't get that response from the other person, they start to get very anxious. So it talks about that anxious, insecure attachment style. Then there's insecure, avoidant attachment style. These are, the folks that tend to, in an argument, kind of shut down, fold their arms, don't want to talk about anything, kind of stonewall, and I'm sure you all have never seen that before in a conversation, but there's the person who tends to withdraw and pull away in the relationship. And then there's sometimes a disorganized attachment, and this is one of the more challenging ones. So as he was looking at these, he noticed that these attachment styles would crop up in the relationships. So let's first start with stats, because as we look at these relationship styles and as we look at how all these things play into the marriage, it might be useful for y'all to hear some of the stats. First of all, when he was doing his marriage lab, he got to the place where he can predict a divorce within 91% accuracy by listening to 15 minutes of conversation. So he can listen to 15 minutes of conversation, and within that 15 minutes can determine with 91% accuracy whether or not that marriage would end in divorce or become an unsatisfactory marriage. Is that pretty impressive? Yeah, like within 15 minutes. And so what he noticed was he would actually ask them to talk about something they disagreed about. Now, because he's asking them to argue, he knows that this is going to bring up tension. But it wasn't the presence of tension that determined whether or not a couple was really going to be able to make it through and have a happy marriage. What really determined it was how they discussed their problems. Not just that they were discussing a problem, but how they discussed it. So 91% accuracy just listening to them interact for as little as 15 minutes. Here's a few other statistics that he found about marriage. One of them is that couples, after the birth of their first child, since it is a stressful time, about 67% of couples experience a large drop in marital satisfaction by in the 3 years after the birth of their first baby. Now, these would be things that, have been nice that, people told us all this stuff before we got married or like gave us that heads up. But many of us crashed right into it, because that's certainly my wife and I, once we had our first kiddo, we, were just kind of given this crash course, and then now here's this child, and there's no more just we, but now there's this us in this family unit, and that whole adjustment can be challenging for people in the beginning. Now, one of the things he noticed is that even though there can be that 67% of couples that experience drop in satisfaction, he was curious about that 33% that didn't, which is where we're going to be looking at in a moment here. Just a few more statistics. 10 years later, researchers determined that compared with the couples who remained happily married, those who ended up unhappy or divorced had secreted 34% higher levels of adrenaline while arguing as newlyweds. So you remember how I was saying that they had them all hooked up? That's one of the things they were checking, is like how much adrenaline is in their system when they're actually arguing. And if they were a less satisfied couple, the amount of adrenaline in their system actually showed up. And so now he wasn't asking them questions about how happy are you. You could just tell by just taking like blood samples and tests. Again, I'm not suggesting that you have to do this, but this is how far he took his research. And so if you look at those numbers, though, it actually tells us something, that when we are in close proximity and a close relationship with someone, it's not just, oftentimes we talk about emotions like, it's just all in your head. But that's not true. It's actually in your body, too, because if you have an increase in adrenaline in your system, you're going to be feeling the effects of that long after. In fact, here's a few more statistics that they showed. They found that another stress hormone it's labeled ACTH. It's adrenocorticotropic hormone, but it's a type of hormone that floods in your system when you are in a fight or flight situation. And they found that even with newlywed couples, wives who ended up in troubled marriages or divorced 10 years later, compared with other ones, it said that in the beginning they were able to predict the fate of newlywed couples 10 years later by just measuring the hormone levels in their blood during their first year of marriage. So how stressed out they were getting in the first year of their marriage was predicting what would be happening in the next 10 years of marriage. It's pretty incredible, isn't it? And so it tells us that something about how we're communicating, even in the very beginning, can give us indicators of what it is that we need to begin to work on. Just a few more statistics here. The current divorce rate in the US is 2.9 persons per 1,000. The way that really kind of works out is that for the people who are married, the divorce rate is somewhere between 40 and 50%, which is relatively high, but it's actually decreased since 1990. But one of the reasons it's decreased since 1990, anybody want to guess, by the way, why it is that divorce rates have gone down since 1990? Right, few people getting married, yeah, exactly right. Yeah, so less people are getting married. Now, one of the things that they found that was really interesting here was that even though less people are getting married, there is something else that's happening. There is something that's happening when people do get married. If you, let me see, I put this here. So the ages between 28 and 32 could be the best time to get married. Now, does anybody have any idea why those ages would be the best ages to get married? Exactly right. So, yeah, all of us who are past 28 and 32, it's like, yes, because your brain actually finishes developing. It's between the ages of like 25 and 30 where your brain is actually done cooking. And so, as it turns out, if you let your brain finish cooking, then like your chances of making more sound decisions in a relationship go up. And it's hard to think of any other decision that's more complex than who are you going to spend the rest of your life with. Because if you're figuring out who you're going to spend the rest of your life with, you're also trying to project what kind of person you want to be, 20, 30 years from now. And so it's not an easy decision to make, and it turns out that waiting until we've reached that full length of maturity is helpful. Now, this doesn't mean you can't get married young and still be happy. It just means that statistically it works out better. The other one here is that people are 75% more likely to end their marriage if a friend is divorced. Now, that's an interesting statistic. Now, anybody want to guess why that happens? So part of it is that your social influences outside of your marriage make a huge difference and an impact on your marriage. it actually makes a huge difference. And so if you have friends that have divorced, it makes it more likely. It's not destiny. No statistic is destiny, but it does tell us that this thing can increase the probability that things move in a different direction. The second one here is that with remarriages, the statistics of divorcing after the second marriage actually goes up with everyone. So it starts out about that 40 to 50% rate, but by the second marriage, it's 67%, and then by the third, it's 75%, and the percentage continues to climb after every marriage. Now, it doesn't mean that a second or third marriage is doomed for failure, but what it does mean is that there is an underlying problem that just divorcing does not fix on its own, which is, again, where we're going to be putting more of our focus today. Let's look at a couple of myths, though. So how many people have heard this myth before, that if we just didn't argue as much, we'd be a happier couple? You've ever heard something like that before, or maybe said that to yourself before? Well, it turns out that that's not really true. Arguing less is not necessarily indicative of a happier couple. Now, my wife will probably tell you that I'm somebody that likes to have a good disagreement. And I say a good disagreement on purpose because I like the process of like trying to sort things out. I don't care to be right all the time. I just like hashing things out and figuring out like where something settles. But if that's not both of our communication styles, then it can become problematic. But simply arguing less is not equated to marital satisfaction. There are some couples that are just more energetic and volatile about how they speak. However, there are things that they say, and the way that they say them in that particular disagreement makes all the difference. So just to give you an example, if I'm talking, or if a couple is talking, I'll use an example that that actually came across in my office before, where someone says, hey, look, I've tried writing down that you need to do the dishes when you get home. I've tried putting it up on a billboard. I tried doing all these things to try to get you to pay attention. And for whatever reason, you just can't seem to figure this out. All right. Now, that doesn't go well because what that is that's a global insult. Now, you may not hear the difference, but I'm going to say the same thing, but in a different way. I've tried to remind you a whole bunch of different ways to do the dishes, and I'm not sure how to communicate this to you. I really wish that you can just do that because that would help me so much if you would just do the dishes. Now, you can probably feel the difference between those two, even though I communicated essentially the same message. But it's that slight difference between the way that those two things are communicated that makes the difference between whether or not a couple is moving in the right direction, if they're moving towards that gridlock and that dissatisfaction in the marriage, or whether or not they're going to be in a healthy marriage. So it's not just arguing less, but there's something about how we talk. The second one is learn to communicate. I think almost every assessment I've done with a couple, when I ask them, hi, what are you here to work on? Like 90% of the time, everybody says the same word. Anybody want to guess that word is? Communication. Every single time. Every single time. I'm not sure I've ever had a couple, maybe unless they've done some counseling before, they say communication. Now, communication is super important. There is something to be said about if we can communicate more nicely, more calmly, more effectively, that can be helpful. But if you consider how you can keep a conversation really calm between you and somebody else by simply just not caring what the other person thinks anymore, then you can see that just being calm when you talk about things is not an indication of happiness. And so, like I remember talking with a couple that came in, and they were just about as non-volatile as you can get, very calm, sat down, asked them, like, tell me about your relationship, and they said, well, we actually get along with most things, like we agree on finances, we agree about how to raise our child, we agree on a lot of things. And so then I asked them, okay, so what are some things that you all like to do to spend your time together? And they just kind of sat there and stared. And they said, I don't know. I said, okay, do y'all have arguments sometimes? Like, oh no, we never fight. And I said, well, when's the last time you all have gone on a date? Probably not since our kid was born. Okay, all right. They're calm. Let me ask you all, do you think they're happy? No, because what's happened is the relationship has been reduced to a roommate situation. And so they peacefully coexist, but there's no passion left in the relationship. So simply calming down and keeping things cool is not necessarily an indicator of marital health. How about the next situation? I put there just some fancy psychobabble there, neuroses or personality problems. Like maybe you're like, well, you don't know my spouse is really volatile, they get really emotional and upset when they actually looked at the statistics there, they found that simply, struggling with depression or some anxiety disorder, that those things were not, they did not decide divorce. It only made up for about like 1% of the variation in whether or not somebody would get divorced, like a 1% difference. And that is not significant enough to say, well, it's because my spouse has, anxiety or depression. Those things are actually not sufficient. What's actually needed in those particular situations is just the ability to connect with one another, to consider the other person's emotions. So I take an example. Remember, I was talking with a couple where the spouse was really struggling with anxieties, like a lot of social anxieties, was really concerned about what other people thought about them, and would become very self-conscious, so didn't like going out places. If they went somewhere, she didn't really want to talk with anybody. She'd be just like right next to him, and whenever he walked away and tried to talk to other people, she'd be very frustrated in the night. It's like, how could you just leave me standing there, And so when I talked to them about that, I had them have a conversation about those anxieties, and I said, well, have you ever talked to your wife about that? Well, yeah, she said that, when she grew up, people didn't really like her, and I said, well, have you talked to her about what that meant to her? So we kind of slowed the conversation down a little bit, and I said, well, ma'am, have you shared with your husband why that bothers you so much? She's like, well, when I was younger, I was always kind of compared with my sister. My sister was more attractive than I was. Everybody always thought she was cool, and I was always in the background, and it seemed that no one really wanted to pay attention to me. Then she began to express like some of the sadness that would come up for her. And we started to talk about like, well, what is it that you're needing in those moments where that sadness comes up? Well, I just need to know I'm not alone and that you really care about me. And so he responded to that. He said, he tells her like, oh, I didn't realize that was the case for you. And really told her that, I love you, and like, I didn't realize that that's why you wanted to be by my side. I thought you were just trying to watch everything that I do, and you just didn't trust me. Henceforth, when they went places, he would keep his arm around her as that reassurance. When he saw that she was feeling nervous, he'd squeeze her hand. And whenever he'd do those things, she would begin to relax. And eventually, she got comfortable being around other people. And so the problem wasn't just her being anxious. The problem was that when that anxiety came up, could the other person be what they needed in those moments? Because oftentimes what happens is when we develop some of these things, whether we're talking about depression or anxiety, the marital relationship actually has the capacity to heal those things. And that's the part that's really incredible to me. In fact, before we're done, I'll be sharing with you just some biblical principles that address this very thing, that the marital relationship is actually a context under which even some of the things that we struggle with can be healed. All right. Conflict resolution. Oftentimes, the original approach to dealing with a lot of couples therapy was just to do conflict resolution. It's like, if we can solve all our conflicts, then we would just be fine. However, that's not necessarily the case, but because there's some problems that when he talked about them, he said some of these problems are like non-solvable problems. Now that sounds really discouraging, but what he's talking about is that some of the problems are being caused by the fact that we have different temperaments. Like, my wife is probably never going to be as into like all this geeky science stuff that I like to read. Now, that could be a problem, could become like this huge problem in our relationship. And she's also into like nutrition, and she really like will read this stuff up, and I'm just like, my head's like, okay, man, I can't keep up. And so we could have this as something where it's like, well, you're interested in this and I'm interested in this, and that could become this huge problem. Or we could learn where these two problems can kind of intersect with one another. Can we find a way to coexist with our differences? And people who are able to do that are able to manage these seemingly unresolvable problems. But simply just having conflict resolution all by itself does not lend itself immediately to a happy marriage. How many people are familiar with quid pro quo? Anybody kind of know what that means? All right, so quid pro quo is, it's almost kind of like the contract deal. So it's like, okay, well, if you will, take out the trash and all this stuff, then I'll sit with you and watch a show with you. As it turns out, when things are done in a contract kind of situation and you're keeping track and tally and keeping points, like, well, I did the dishes for you like 3 times, and now it's time for you to pay up. As you can probably imagine, that's not really satisfying. Because if somebody's just doing something for you because they owe you, that is not the basis of like a happy and founded relationship. In fact, if you find yourself keeping track and keeping points and tallies, then that's an indicator that something is starting to go south in the marriage. It means that something is missing for you in the marriage. And if we're just only doing things because we're obliged to, that actually can lead to more resentment. So the quid pro quo approach is also something that is a myth that works in marriages. How about this one? Common interests keep you together. I thought of there was a cute example where it's like saying, like, you know, maybe you and somebody else really like whitewater rafting, you know, like you really enjoy doing this rafting trip, but then the other person also likes rafting, but then they're like, oh man, you call that a J-stroke? Man, you're an idiot. Like, so if we have the same interest, but we don't have the same values around that interest, then those things can actually turn into a fight as well. So simply having common interests is not all that it takes. It takes a bit more. Affairs. Oftentimes people come to the conclusion that affairs are what cause divorce, and this is something that is contributing to divorce rates. When they did the real research, even when they asked people after they had a divorce where there was an affair, what they said, like something like 75% of people where an affair occurred in the marriage, 75% of them said that that was not the reason that the marriage is dissolved, because they understood that that separation began before the affair ever started. Affairs are usually symptoms of something that's happening in a marriage, not the cause of the end of the marriage in the first place. All right. Hopefully everybody's brains are not melting from all these things, but I like to bust all the myths first because sometimes we think if we just don't have these problems, then this means that everything is fine, but I believe things can be better. How about this one? Anybody heard this one, that men aren't designed for marriage? Have ever heard that one before? Okay. All right, so there are lots of reasons why that's not true. First one is that people used to think that men were the ones that were more likely to be unfaithful in marriages. But what they found is that as women started joining more of the workforce, as soon as women were in the workforce, women have actually exceeded men in the number of affairs that occur. And so it turns out that it's not a crime of men, but it's a crime of opportunity that seems to be driving that particular statistic. So it's not a man thing. In fact, research studies show that men who are in happy, healthy relationships make more money, have more sexual intimacy, live longer, have less chronic illness, show less cognitive impairment in their later years. So this whole notion that men have to have multiple partners and all this to be happy is patently false. Now, if you've read your Bible, you know that that is already true. But for those who don't, it still turns out that the things that the Bible has had to say about these subjects turn out to be true, because you're not likely to be more happy if you're outside of a happy and committed relationship. How about the one that men are from Mars? So oftentimes this men are from Mars, women are from Venus comes from this idea that men tend to want to have physical intimacy more than women do. But listen to this. The determining factor in whether a wife feels satisfied with their sexual life or their romance and passion in their marriage is, by 70%, the quality of what? The couple's friendship. For men, the determining factor is, by 70%, the quality of what? How about that? So that's the same for both of them. Anyway, I hope these little facts are interesting to you, because I like that human relationships turn out to be far more complex than what's often shown to us on TV. So men and women come from the same planet after all, as it turns out. What about the costs? Thanks to the work of researchers and Louis Verburg and James House, both of the University of Michigan, we now know that an unhappy marriage can increase your chances of getting what? Of getting sick by roughly 35% and even shorten your life by an average of 4 to 8 years. Isn't that incredible? Now, part of the reason for this is that they found that when a happy couple is faced with illness or infection, this is part of John Gottman's lab thing, that they found that when they're exposed to some kind of infection, people in happy relationships produce more white blood cells and antibodies to fight off the disease than people who are in unhappy relationships. Your immune system literally will correspond to your degree of satisfaction in your relationship. That's incredible. This is actually a health benefit to marriages. If you have a healthy and happy marriage, it actually expands your lifespan by 4 to 8 years. The flip side, people who are happily married live longer, live healthier lives than either divorced people or those who are unhappily married. Scientists know for certain that these differences exist, but we're not sure why yet. There are some indicators, as I said, with the immune system functioning, but there are several other factors that contribute to it as well. For instance, people who are happily married eat healthier, because what happens is the spouse starts looking out for the other person and starts saying, hey, maybe we should take care of it this way, not like in a criticizing, nagging kind of way, but they start looking out for each other's health. And it's really incredible how that works out. All right. Solutions. All right. So we talked a lot about the statistics. We talked about the myths. So what about the solutions? What is it that really tends to help marriages work? All right, how many people are familiar with the concept of emotional intelligence? Has anybody heard that term before? Okay. So emotional intelligence, for those of you who haven't heard of it before, is roughly based on two things: the awareness of your own emotions and your awareness of the emotions of others around you. People who are able to name and describe their own emotions are far more likely to be able to name and describe the emotions of the person with whom they are in a relationship. Emotional intelligence, as it turns out, is not just something that predicts success in marriage. Emotional intelligence actually tends to be a higher predictor of success in life for children than IQ is, that is their emotional quotient, or their intelligence quotient. So their ability to get good grades in school is not going to be as large of a factor to their success as their emotional intelligence is. If you have an emotionally intelligent child, they will actually be more successful, make more money, have longer lasting relationships than somebody who's just simply intellectually smart. It's a really incredible thing. And there is something that helps to build up that emotional intelligence. So some of my work with, in working with couples, I've noticed that there will usually be at least one person in the relationship who says, I don't really care about feelings, or I don't really have feelings, or I don't do the emotions thing. Anybody ever heard this before? Like, you've heard this comment before? Okay, I don't do feelings. Okay. Oftentimes, roughly about 75% of the time, it's men who say this, but it's not always just men, because women sometimes will come from that same perspective. And so, in a particular situation, I was talking with a couple, and I was asking them about what happens when they have a conflict. And the wife says, well, I try to talk to Sam about like what's going on in our marriage, and I say to him like, hey, we need to talk about this, and we really need to have this conversation. And as soon as I start talking, he just tunes me out. He just completely tunes me out. And then I say, well, Sam, what's happening over there? It's like, well, she always just, like we were having a perfectly good day, and then she just ruins it by bringing up all this stuff from the past. Like, why can't we just talk about what's going on just here and now? Why do we got to talk about the past all the time? If we could just move on and let it go, we could be much happier, but she likes to hold on to things. Does this sound familiar to anyone? And so as they're talking about this, I say, well, Sam, what do you think it is that Sally's feeling when all this is going on? Well, she seems like she's really upset, but I don't really do the emotions thing. Sometimes she'll cry, and I don't know what to do about that. I really don't like talking about feelings. Now, that's where I pause the conversation, because when somebody says they don't like talking about feelings and that they don't have feelings, I recognize that there's maybe a contradiction in those two things. Because if you say you don't like something, guess what that means? That means you have a feeling about it, right? Like there's something about that feels uncomfortable. And so oftentimes what I'll do is I'll say, well, what is that feeling that's coming up for you? And here's what it is. When you see somebody who has the tendency to maybe stonewall, not talk as much, or just kind of do the silent treatment thing in the conversation, sometimes it could look like the person who's doing all the talking and wanting to talk this thing out and wanting to talk about the relationship and all the things that we're going through, it'll look like that person is the most emotionally elevated. Maybe they sound angry or they sound really anxious. But when they actually did studies on both of them, it turned out that the person who was quiet was experiencing the most emotional intensity. When they were looking at them, their adrenaline is through the roof, their heart rates and everything is just as off as it could possibly be. It's actually the person who's not talking that's usually the most emotionally flooded. On average, men tend to be more emotionally flooded by conflicts within a marriage than women are. And as it turns out, it takes even longer for men to calm down after a conflict than it does for women. Like that little escalation and all that, for a man, it could take quite a bit more time than it does for the woman or whoever the person is that tends to talk about their emotions more. And so one of the things that will happen there, they talk about it as like a negative sentiment override. What's happening there is the person is becoming so flooded with those emotions that they just kind of shut down. And of course, it's kind of this vicious cycle, right? Because the more he stops talking, the more she feels ignored. And then if she starts to feel ignored, she starts to get upset, like, oh my gosh, you don't care about me. Like, how can you just sit there and fold your arms when I'm clearly going through all this pain? And he's like, how can you keep talking to me like this? You're always saying all these really messed up things to me. I don't want to fight with you. You're always turning everything into a fight. And then boom, off to the corners. Now, what tends to not happen is that both of those positions are defense. If I fold my arms and stop talking, that protects me. And if I'm on the other side where I'm trying to dig into this person and get them to talk to me about what's going on, that might be helping me to get my emotions out, but it's not helping the person with whom I'm speaking. The other person just feels beat up and attacked. Now, what tends to shift this is if the couple can turn towards each other and really attune to the emotions. If we can actually look at those emotions and begin to describe them. So typically what I'll do at that point when, if Sam says, I don't really do the feelings thing, I don't like talking about the feelings, I'll start to ask him questions about what's happening for you when your wife wants to talk to you about something. He's like, well, first thing that goes in my head is, here we go again, right? Here we go again, we're going down this route. And so I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean though? Like, why is that such a bad thing for you? Well, it's like, well, because after we fight, then we don't talk for like 2 days. And it's like, so that's, you don't like when that happens. Like, no, like it's miserable. I want to be able to spend time with my wife. I want us to be able to do nice things together. But as soon as we have these fights, it just tells me that we're not gonna have any good time together for like the next 2 or 3 days, and we're just gonna be shut out. And so I say, you really miss your wife when that happens. And oh man, and we start feeling things again. By the way, if you miss someone, there's an emotion that's associated with that. You know what it is? It's not anger. Yeah, so that loneliness is sadness. Now, one of the things I spend a little bit of time doing with folks is helping them to not only know what an emotion is, but what its solution is. Every emotion actually has a solution behind it. So this is just a free one here. When sadness comes up, it's an emotion that's associated with loss. Like in this particular case, he loses his connection with Sally. He loses that happy moment that they could be sharing with one another. Now, when he experiences that loss, it strikes him as sadness. Now, sadness yearns for something, and I bet you all will figure it out. So I'm going to kind of ask some live questions, and if you feel like you have a good answer, then throw it out there. At funerals, people are typically sad, yes? What do you notice people are doing at funerals with each other? They cry. What else do they do? They hug. What else do they do? They talk. And what do they usually talk about? They talk about the one they lost. They share their losses with each other. They seek to understand each other. We seek to console each other. And so it tells us immediately how sadness is resolved. Sadness is resolved through connection and understanding. And y'all probably do this for, if you have any small children or nieces or nephew or grandchildren, when you see them fall down and cry, what do? Do you shame them and say, wipe the tears up, quit being a little baby? Like, dude, is this what you say to the small children? What do you typically say to them? Now, of course, we don't want to, like, if a child is not that badly hurt, we might say, oh, okay, are you okay? But when you know they're really, really hurt by something, what do you typically do? Yeah. Reassurance and comfort. And you don't stand off at a distance, right? You actually come closer. And so what it turns out is really needed in these moments of conflict, and so I'm sitting here talking with Sam, by the way, who has no emotions, but suddenly is like introduced to his own sadness there for a moment. I say, have you ever told Sally that when you start to argue, you start to feel that frustration and that anxiety because you feel like you're going to lose that connection with her? You ever said that to her? And the answer usually is, no. He turns around and tells Sally, after I've kind of poked him with the cattle prod a couple times to get him to talk, he looks over at Sally and he actually says it. He notices that his voice gets a little bit shaky, and Sally hears this from him. And she's like, oh my goodness, I didn't know he had a heart. This is incredible. And they share this moment where conflict becomes an opportunity for connection. And this is why now, as a therapist, anytime somebody comes with a conflict, I'm like, all right, here we go. Because I know where there's conflict, there's opportunity for connection. Anyway, all right. So, makes sense so far, everyone? Let me make sure I'm not losing anyone on this. Attunement. So the way attunement typically works, and it's more obvious when you see little faces like this. Have you seen those pictures where infants are just like kind of doing the cooing face? I wanted to find one, but I couldn't find one fast enough before we started today. Have you seen those pictures of babies cooing? Like they kind of have that, where their mouths are kind of like in that cooing position, their eyes are wide open. All right, when you look at those pictures, what do you notice happens inside? Like, what do you notice you want to do when you see those pictures? Yeah, right. It's like this, it's like this smile. You want to join with them. Did you know that universally, regardless of culture or language that people speak, everyone does baby talk? And it sounds like sing-song kind of thing, like, oh, baby, want to do this, and da-da-da-da-da. It's very elevated, and it sounds kind of sing-songy. And you know what that does? It teaches children how to talk, because we learn more through imitation and song than we do through just syntax and language. And it actually turns out it is the way to speak to your children. The second thing that's happening is when that little baby is staring at your face, his brain or her brain is making 1,000 neuronal connections between neurons every second. Just like that. Every facial expression that you make, every time you respond to them, everything that you do with them, they start to imprint that on their minds about, this is how I impact the world. If you want to think about it a different way, your face is that child's mirror. They figure out who they are by how you look at them. That's not fake stuff. This is part of the reason why in that first slide where I was talking about the attachment thing is that, children who, if they make faces or they cry and they're totally ignored, start to think they're invisible. And I wish I could tell you about all the cases where I've seen this happen, but children who have grown up in homes where they were not paid attention to, they walk around in life as though they're invisible. It's pretty incredible. Yes? Is that why twins are so close together? It's part of it, yeah, because their attunement is like really tight. Yeah, So the question was about twins, like why they are so close together. It's like, yeah, because they are constantly mirroring off each other. If they're kept in close proximity, they will mirror off each other, along with some of the genetic pieces. Because I've shared this with people before, but an identical twin is one sperm and one egg, and it splits in two. And so the only difference between an identical twin and you is that when you split, you didn't split all the way. It's one person split into two people. It is the strangest thing. Every time I think about that, it just weirds me out. That means every single one of you could have been two people. So anyway, but those facial expressions, that doesn't change though. Even in adulthood, we start to read. We look at our reflections in the face of other people. So if I ask you all to do just a quick experiment with me, this is like a 20-second experiment. I just want you to, and you could just do this with the person who's sitting next to you. One person be the speaker, and one person be the listener. And just for like 20 seconds, all I want you to do is talk to the other person about your day, for the speaker. For the listener, for this first one, I want you to listen to them and be enthusiastic about your facial expressions and just kind of listen to them and like follow them, okay? So just 20 seconds, just tell them just a little bit about your day, and then I'm going to rerun this, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. So if you have somebody that you're sitting next to that you can talk to, go ahead and do this. If you don't, then like find somebody and just drift together or something. We could do this. So just 20 seconds. Tell a little bit about your day. One person's speaker, one person's listener. And those who are listening, be interested. About 5 more seconds. Okay, all right, so pause. Now, I want you all to do the same thing, but this time, whoever's going to be the listener, I want you to keep the most deadpan face you possibly can while looking at them, okay? So we'll just do this will be for 30 seconds. The speaker, you go ahead and talk, and the listener, deadpan as you possibly can. No response whatsoever. About 10 more seconds. All right, good. All right. So, speakers, on that second run, what did you notice began to happen as you were talking and getting zero response from the other person? What did you notice was happening? How did you feel as you were talking? Right. Motivation starts going down. What else did you notice?
I felt very uncomfortable.
Yes, you start to feel like really uncomfortable, like almost kind of like on the spot. What else? Anybody else? Nervous. Yeah, so. Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, sorry. So yes. So sorry. I forget y'all can't hear everything. So yes, she was saying feel nervous. You start to feel like, hey, there's no response. Like there's nothing going on here. It's this awkward silence. It just starts to space starts to get filled. Anyone else? What'd you notice? Yes. Right. Now just think about that for a second. The person is doing nothing, but that's not how it feels, is it? It's like the mirror's turned off. You start to feel like I'm not important. What I'm talking about isn't really important. You know what I've noticed too is I'll notice that when the person's not listening, I'll just listen to everybody talk, and I notice that progressively as we get toward the end, the volume goes down. You probably didn't subjectively notice that, but everybody starts talking a little less enthusiastically. Did anybody start to question whether or not what you were saying was important? Yes. Right, it's like, even something that you thought you maybe were excited about, it's like you lose all the enthusiasm. It's like, yeah, well, I mean, I came home. It starts out with like, yeah, I had this really good day at work, you know, my boss promoted me and all this other stuff, and I see no response. It's like, okay, when I drove home and traffic was, okay, never mind. We lose all that morale, lose all that motivation, which means that what infants are experiencing hasn't stopped just because we're adults. Because what's happening here is that you're getting feedback about your worth and value and the importance of what you're saying from the other person's face. Flip it around. For those who were talking when the other person was listening enthusiastically, what did you notice when they were listening to you enthusiastically? What did you notice about you as the speaker role? What did you notice? As the speaker. When you were being listened to enthusiastically, what did you notice as the speaker? Yes?
She was completely lit up in her face.
Mm-hmm.
The most important thing she was hearing.
Mm-hmm. And what happened for you? Yes. So he was saying that when she was looking, she looked like she was completely lit up and very interested in what he was saying. And as he was talking about it, he started to feel better about what he was sharing. Anybody else? Anybody else notice something similar? Encouraging. Huh? Right. Yeah. Like sometimes, like, yeah, as you get more animated as you're telling the story, you get more excited about what you're saying. It's like suddenly now it's like there's this listening audience and I feel alive again. Now I want you just to think about this. This is 30 seconds of just really listening to each other and 30 seconds of shutting the other person out, and all these emotions happen within that short amount of time. That's how powerful it is to just pay attention to somebody and really listen to them. Now, let me tell you something. If you can experience this, there's something that they've labeled as positive sentiment override. This was something from the University of Oregon by Robert Weiss. He talked about positive sentiment override. What he noticed is like we talked about in the beginning there, the reason why some couples can have lots of arguments and not be upset is because there's this positive sentiment override. At the end of the day, even if they're arguing, they know this other person really listens to them and really thinks the world of them. And so they can disagree, but it doesn't throw them off. Example, let's say that wife is doing her hair, or husband is brushing his teeth, and he says, honey, can you grab my glasses? She's like, not right now. Okay, and he's like, oh, okay, well, if there's positive sentiment override, he'll say, oh, okay, she must be busy. Okay, I'll take care of it. If there's negative sentiment override, like he's in this, the marriage is in this place where he always thinks that she doesn't care about him or anything like that, and he says, honey, could you get my glasses? He says, not right now. It's like, oh, yeah, I guess you wouldn't want to do that right now because you never want to do anything for me. You don't even care. Same situation. But if the negative sentiment is dominating, then the way they interpret these isolated situations completely changes. And so you can create more of the positive sentiment override by having more of these moments where you actually listen to and are engaged with the other person. One of the ways that Gottman talked about this is kind of like having your love tank filled. If that love tank is filled, then you can tolerate most of these things that just don't go right. When you're having a really good day and you trip on something, it's not the end of the world. But if you feel like the whole world is just kind of spitting on you all the time and all this stuff, and then you have like some one bad thing happen, it's just another thing to prove that life is against you. And we can actually change the way that that is happening in the relationship by having more of these positive interactions, more of this positive sentiment. Now, I gave you all handouts, and what we're going to do in just a moment is we're going to look at a couple of things that are on there. But I want to share with you just a couple of biblical principles around marriage and help you to understand why it's both challenging and rewarding. Now, some of you may be familiar with some of these passages, and if you're not somebody who reads the Bible, then I think these principles still apply regardless. This is actually something that's proved out in psychology itself. So this comes from Mark chapter 10 and verse 6 through 8. It says, "But from the beginning of the creation, God made them how? Male and female. And for this cause shall his man leave who? His father and mother, and cleave to his wife." Now, we often read that and we're like, oh, okay, that means, in-laws, you just leave them behind and now you have your new family. But I want to submit to you that there's something far deeper, and it's something that has been borne out by the research itself. What relationship is the marriage compared to? Because it doesn't say, for this cause shall a man leave his brother and sister. He does not say, for this cause shall a man leave his friends. What relationship is the marriage compared to? Yeah, the parenting relationship. So check this out. I think it's probably not a secret that how we're raised has a tremendous impact on who we become, right? But one thing I want to share with you here is that according to the scripture, the marriage relationship can have every bit of a deep and lasting impact on you, as does the way you were raised. It's actually, so I remember working with a couple, and the couple was having some arguments and some fights, and so we'll just call them Dane and Wilda. So Dane and Wilda are having this conversation, and they're using a lot of statements that I don't recommend using, such as like, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe you're acting this way. You're just like your mom," because that always wins points, right? Like, yeah. Because it's like, oh, I am just like my mom. That's why I'm stupid. I didn't. If you had not told me that, I would not have been inclined to change. But now that you've told me I'm like my mom, or I'm just like my dad, or anything like that, that helps me tremendously. Anybody ever been converted by that statement? Okay. So those things come up. And so the couple was going on and on fighting, and they were like, I don't see why, he's having such a problem with this. I'm not his mom. I don't know why he's just projecting all this stuff onto me. And when I was talking with them, it's like, well, there's probably a really good reason. Now, biblically, I can tell you exactly why it is. And it's because you are in the same role as the parent was. Because the parent was the one whose face you looked at to determine how valuable you were, and whether or not what you had to say really mattered, and whether or not your existence was valuable to anyone. And now it's not your mother that does that for you anymore. It's your spouse. That's kind of heavy, isn't it? The good news about it, though, is that if there's been damage done in the original relationship, it can be healed in the marriage relationship. In fact, it can be healed in any relationship that goes as deeply and connects as deeply as the parental relationship. Now, let me just ask you all a question. And for those of you who may or may not, believe in God and all these things, do you know what, in the Christian faith, what God is called? Jesus tells people to call God their Father. Why do you think that is? It goes back to that all-important relationship that started there in the beginning. And even if our parents mess up, whether it's through marriage or through our walk with God, those things can be healed through that relationship. So this is why marriage is both challenging and rewarding, because it's a daunting task to step into that role and to ask someone else to step into that role for you. But it's unavoidable, because once you get that close, that is what you're encountering. That's not bad news, though. Like, that can really do something that's incredible and healing for us. And as we experience there, even just 30 seconds of that can be pretty amazing. In fact, Jesus' first miracle was this. He turns water into what? Wine. Now, I want you to notice the comment that's made here, and I think this connects to the relationship as well. "And saith unto him, Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. but thou hast kept the good wine until now. Now, I think that illustration was on purpose. Because you know what? Most of the time in marriages, guess what everybody's favorite part is? The beginning, right? It's the stuff that came out in the beginning. It's like, yeah, we were just really in love, and we were just completely irrational. It's like, you're not paying your rent. Oh my gosh, what a rebel. But once the bills start coming through, it's not so cute, and then all those things start to become a challenge. But with Jesus, his proposal was that the good stuff comes later. Not that it's not good in the beginning, but it gets better. It's not the end of love, it's the beginning of it. There's a text that talks about the same thing. As men set forth the best wine first, and afterwards that which is worse, so does the world with its gifts, which it offers to please the eye and fascinate the senses, but it proves to be unsatisfying. The wine turns to bitterness and gaiety to gloom. That which was begun with songs and mirth ends with weariness and disgust, but the gifts of Jesus are ever fresh and new. The feast which he provides for the soul never fails to give satisfaction and joy. Each gift increases the capacity of the receiver to appreciate and enjoy the blessings of the Lord. And so it is with the marriage, that if you can begin to build the marriage, now we're going to depict this as the sound relationship house. If you can begin to build the marriage, keeping these concepts in mind, then the marriage can actually improve and actually grow in its capacity. In fact, for every day that you're able to provide each other with these kinds of joys, you actually increase your ability to experience them again in the future. And so you can make your relationship like that first time every time, but more. So this will be this relationship house. We won't go through all the details of it, but at the very bottom of it, there is a statement there that says, build your love maps. So what I'd like to do is to give a moment for you all to maybe, for those of you who would like to do this really quickly, is like for just like a minute or two, go ahead and check out this first handout here that says Love Maps Questionnaire. You'll see at the top of it, it says Love Maps Questionnaire. There's questions on the front and back. You can score it a little bit later, but it has 20 questions that are there, and they're just all true and false questions. And so you can fill it out by yourself, or you can fill it out with your spouse, however you'd like to do that. But I want to give just like a couple of minutes to fill that out, and then we're going to look at our last couple points for tonight, and then I'll make sure that if there's a question or two that I can answer this evening, then we'll go ahead and do that. So just for like a couple minutes, go ahead and take a look at that questionnaire there and go ahead and fill it out. And so just a couple minutes, and then we'll finish up. Did everybody get a handout, by the way? Does everybody have one? Yes? No? Okay. All right, about one more minute, and if you don't finish, it's okay. I just want you to have a sense of the questions there. Few more moments. Okay, all right, so we'll pause there. It's okay if you didn't finish, but just at a quick glance, anybody notice that anybody feel like you know the answers to all the questions so far? Anybody? Yeah, most of them? Okay. Now, at the end of it, it asks you to actually score it. But this actually becomes a really nice way to begin building that foundation part there. So at the very bottom there on the screen, you can see where it says enhance your love maps. This is going to be one of the exercises that you can do together. So this first one has the questions. The second handout right here has the 20 questions game. Now this 20 question games has like actually 60 questions on it. And you just pick 20 out of them, and you keep it as an enjoyable and fun activity to do with each other. It's actually kind of nice to try to see how you can do it, see if you can outscore your partner or your spouse on this particular quiz, and see how you really do with this. And if you don't do that well, this actually tells you that there's a lot of things you could be talking about that we're not actually talking about. And so build these maps with each other. Really try to get to the place where you can answer these questions and get to know your spouse all over again, because a lot of times what's happened in the relationship is that that very foundation itself is the part that oftentimes gets messed up first, and that is the friendship. Now, sometimes we can think that we're friends, but sometimes we forget to talk to each other like friends, to really genuinely be interested in each other and really try to learn things about each other. So that will be the first task between this meeting and the next one, is to fill this out with your spouse, your loved one, maybe the person that you're courting. And one of the things I want to throw out there is that even with when they looked at couples, oftentimes when I see a couple, it's because they're like 5, not even 5, probably 2 steps away from divorce a lot of times, because people wait until the very last minute. The earlier, the better. Now, it's not too late. If you haven't gone and done some of these things with each other, it's not too late to get involved with it. But they found that if couples do this even in their courtship phases, the chances of being happily married are just like exponentially higher than if they didn't do these things beforehand. So anyway, go through these exercises with each other, build that friendship up, because that serves as the foundation. In fact, this principle is not just unique to the marital relationship. This is true even in the spiritual relationship. Having that friendship within your relationship, even with God, if that is something that you have invited into your life at this point, is something that actually builds and sets the foundation for it. One of the things that Jesus says to his disciples, he says, "I no longer call you servants, but friends." It is the foundation of the relationship, is build this friendship. Now, the other 7 principles I have listed up there, and they'll be the ones that we'll go through. After tonight, we'll be doing 2 principles per evening, and I'll make sure that each night that there's activities for you all to do. Please invite other people along to be able to come, because I think even if all you did was invite more of this into your marriage, I believe that every single one of us has the capacity to grow. Whether you feel like you're happily married or you're going through some struggles and trials, these things are absolutely helpful. They actually improve marital satisfaction, and they improve the trajectory of marriage by like something like 60 to 80% when people follow these particular principles in their marriage. It's also not a coincidence that there's 7 principles there. If anybody asks me a question about that, I'll share that with you next time. But these are these 7 principles, and so today the emphasis is going to be on enhancing your love maps. So you're going to be looking at the question, how well do you know each other? Now, I mentioned before that whole falling in love experience is designed to actually cause you to be both curious and excited to learn about each other. This is part of the reason why when we have that falling in love experience, you want to call the person and talk to them all the time, like you're just constantly thinking about them. Where are they? Like, when am I going to see them again? There's all kinds of things that are going on in your body that cause that to happen, increase in dopamine, decrease in serotonin, all kinds of other things if you care about the chemistry of it. But all of them point towards actually causing you to almost be obsessed with the other person. But the reason for that is that it's driving you to learn more about the other person. Now, over time, those things will begin to dissipate. But if you can maintain that curiosity and keep learning about each other, the relationship will actually continue to grow. And so this is some of the thought process behind this, that if you can hit this foundational piece of enhancing your love maps, you can rebuild and rekindle that fire in your relationship. So long-lasting love depends on maintaining an interest in one another. In the nights to follow, we're going to apply some simple principles to the marriage. Some quick samples on that are the 4 horsemen. So as it turns out, in relationships that are heading towards disaster, there are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, that if you see these things going on in your marriage, you can know that it is time to begin to make some changes. It does not mean your marriage is destined for doom, but these are things that indicate that you could be heading in the wrong direction. One of them is criticism, and which I kind of gave a quick illustration of that. You know, criticism, there's a big difference between, I really need your help, it really frustrates me when you forget to do the laundry, versus you can't do anything right. So anyway, we'll be talking about the 4 horsemen, and we'll look at how you actually begin to shift those. And this will actually be in one of the handouts as well, so we're going to look at the 4 horsemen. The second thing is we're going to look at how to make repair attempts. There are ways in which relationships, what they found is that if somebody has conflicts, if they can make repair attempts to fix those things after they happen, this actually improves the way in which these conflicts are experienced and the positivity within the marriage. If you can repair it, then it can actually turn conflict into an opportunity for connection. Just like the example that I gave with Sam and Sally over there, when he can share with her that the reason he doesn't like to fight with her is because he feels like he's going to lose that connection with her. That's a repair attempt, and it can turn a conflict into a connection. So we'll be going over those. The third one will be looking at what to avoid, which actually this one will be what to do, how to make those attunements. We talked about the face-to-face and how to really be a good listener. We'll be looking at how you build up those skills and some simple solutions. Here's one that's free, the 6-second kiss. A kiss that lasts 6 seconds is proven to strengthen connection between your partner when performed daily. So there's a nice simple solution for you. That doesn't even take a whole lot of work to do, does it? Hopefully it doesn't take a lot of work to do. Anyway, so simple solutions. So this will be one of many things where there are these very simple solutions that you can begin to introduce to your relationship to improve the quality of your relationship. All right. So as we kind of come to a close here, the handout that's here with the fondness and admiration, this one kind of works along that foundational piece around building the love maps as well. There's actually a 7-week activity that you're encouraged to participate in and do. It actually lists things that you can do on a daily basis to begin to enhance and build your friendship. So with that being said, I wanted to find out, were there any quick questions that maybe I could ask about? Yes? Yes, yeah.
I wanted clarification on the questionnaire. Are we answering these questions for ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And not for the other person?
Yes, sir. You're answering, yeah, so the question was, are you answering these questions for yourself or for your partner? You're answering it for yourself. Like, can you answer these questions? Do you know who your significant other's best friend is? Yeah.
Do you recommend to take it twice, once for ourselves and once for the other?
Well, you each would do it for yourselves and then just see how you did. It's kind of it's just a nice, friendly, competitive game, but you want to try to outscore your significant other. So, you know, you at least get bragging rights afterwards. Like, I know you better than you know me, but you can always resolve that one too. All right. Any other questions about like the handouts or anything that we've talked about this evening? I could probably take one more, but then after that, any other questions, please do write those things down because I will make sure to answer those questions because obviously 4 nights you can't comprehensively cover everything that can possibly happen in a marriage. But if you have questions around that, I want to definitely make sure I'm able to address those. But any other last questions for this evening before? Yes.
So, speaking about how people connect with their father and mother,
Mm-hmm.
is it a tricky or slippery slope when, on one sense, you don't want to impose or superimpose the distinct relationship you've had, whether it was good or bad, and then realize that, okay, this person is their own person. They may be in that role, but in one sense, it could be looked as unfair or too much of a burden or maybe not enough of a challenge. How do you navigate through what you are submitting?
Okay. All right. So the question is, how do you navigate the process of recognizing that whether good or bad, the marital relationship seems to have an overlap with the parental relationship? That is, how do you not overburden them with the responsibility of essentially having to be your mom or dad again? So I think that's kind of like, you know, not going so far into that role. So the thing that balances it is what makes the connection is that the needs that you have within the relationship remain the same. And the way that you meet those needs is not by stepping into like a parental role where I take care of everything for you. But what you do is you begin to address the emotional needs. So here's a quick illustration of it. So my role as a parent is to help my kids grow. Like my intent is always to make sure that they get to a place where they can do these things independently of me. And when I provide support on that kind of level, it prevents the kind of dependence that a child would experience, because at the end of the day, we're not children anymore. And if I'm providing that support in an appropriate kind of way, it won't create the dependence. That's the short answer. There's a lot of steps to that. So when I share this, it's more so just to highlight the fact that there are reasons why these things come up. Now, the steps and how to do them are really kind of laid out in some of these principles that we're going to be talking about. Like the first one is just developing a friendship, which initially in the parent-child relationship, that parent is acting the part of all these things, and slowly the child begins to find those relationships externally. And so one of the things that you do together is you begin to build that friendship, but you don't become your spouse's only friend, but you become that model friend, which is very different, so that it prevents that complete dependence on the other person. So I don't know if that initially answers the question here. Or, okay, all right. Okay, so for any other questions, please jot them down and leave them here so we can collect them. Yes, and we have additional flyers too, if you'd like to be able to share those with people. For the further nights, since this one was a lot of introduction and heavy information, we will do a little more interactive activities during the next ones. But please do invite as many people as you believe can be blessed by this meetings that we're having. So with that being said, I'd like to be able to dismiss with a brief word of prayer, and then everybody can go out the way. Father in heaven, I want to thank you for this opportunity to be able to talk about marriage and the relationship as you have shown both in your word, and as we see these principles, I pray that you would bless each one of us in our exploration of it, whether we've been married for a while or we're thinking about taking those steps. I pray that you would guide us and help us, Lord, to develop that friendship with each other, and that for those who maybe haven't yet, that we would also build that friendship with you. And I ask for these blessings in the name of Jesus. Amen.